This is The Life and Legacy of Keith Faldy, Episode 1, Childhood. Before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee. And before thou camest forth out of the womb, I sanctified thee. And I had ordained thee a prophet unto the nations. When telling a story about someone's life, it's really hard to know where to begin. We obviously should start at the beginning. But what is the beginning? You could say birth, but even down to the details of where someone is born and when they're born and what family they're born into comes an endless number of stories that resulted in that family being in that time, in that place, in that country. So I began to think of all the world events that move people around the world and have moved people around the world, and there's just an infinite number of places we could have gone. And this sent me down a rabbit trail of how these events have shaped our world today, whether it was the famines in Northern Europe, religious persecutions, wars, hostile takeovers of various nations. These events that we read about in history, both in recent and distant history, have shaped our world in a way that we don't often think about or appreciate. So we'll have family history episodes that will be added in addendum to this series, but we decided to just keep it simple for now and start at the most logical beginning, which is your birth. So that leaves us in the wake of World War II. Your parents have been married several years and they're living with your grandma. It's the earliest years of the baby boom. So let's get started from right there.
Okay. Yeah, it was since I was born in 46, of course, the war ended in 45. And so the real start of the baby boom generation was 46. It was, of course, I don't remember this, but just looking back and listening to my dad and filling in stuff, it was an interesting time because all of the anxiety and focus and hard work of war ended just kind of suddenly, when the Japanese surrendered. And the country, of course, but all these several million, I think around 12 million veterans who served in World War II, most of them are back. And of course, ones that were married started having kids, ones that weren't married, a lot of them getting married. The factories and stuff had all been retooled for making war equipment. And so, as my dad would talk about, very little was available during World War II as far as new equipment. They just had to keep their farm equipment, cars and stuff. They just had to keep them going somehow or another. So factories were all retooling. There was just a lot of work. A lot of financial people predicted a huge recession or depression, but it turned out to be the opposite after World War II, as there was really kind of a boom time. When I was born, well, my parents were married back in 1939. They didn't have any kids the first 5 years, and then my older brother Leon was born in 44, and then I was born in 46 there. And my parents were living with my grandmother, my dad's mother, at their house. We had part of the house there, one end of it. The house was sort of a T-shaped house, and we were kind of on the crossbar part of the T. Our part of the house was. There wasn't a lot of room, but there was plenty to get by for a young married couple in those days with just a couple of kids. And later on there, when my next brother Jim was born, then they moved down to this other house on land there, but that's another part of the story further on. But I was born July 4th, 1946. The reason I was born in Red Wing, Minnesota, and not Wisconsin was it was like 25 miles down there to Red Wing from where we lived. But that was the closest hospital where they had much of any kind of facilities. So that's where we went when anything happened, even though it was a pretty good drive back in those days. I was born with a large birth defect. My pectoral muscle on my left side was all missing, or is all missing, I should say. So, your body just compensates in a lot of ways, but there were a lot of things I couldn't do, like grip inwards with my hands, And so Leon used to kind of make fun of me because I was flat-footed too, and Leon and Jim both made fun of me for that because we'd be out like walking on something, went barefoot, and they were like, your footprint's supposed to look like this, and yours looks like that. But anyway, and then I had other little things too, like I couldn't trill with my tongue, and all my brothers could, and they would make fun of me for that. They kept trying to teach me how to do it, and I could not do it. But later I found out in studying biology and everything that some of those things are genetic. So I was like, okay, the reason I can't trill is I can't trill, period. Anyway, but I never could make that work. And there were just some things like that. But the pectoral muscle thing, that'll come up to here later because even though it, it made certain things difficult, it didn't slow me down, from growing up and playing and all the things and working and everything else. But it came into play, God does everything with a reason, and it came into play big time in life later on, in a sense that God wanted to direct my life. So, and I used to, I'd always, when like I went swimming or something, I'd always wear a t-shirt because I was always kind of embarrassed about it ever since. So it was interesting though, because back when I was a kid, families still, and especially my mother, but my dad too, there were certain things that happened in the family that you just didn't tell anybody. People had like family secrets, which nowadays it seems to pretty much be non-existent because everybody just talks about everything, good, bad, indifferent, whatever it might be. But my mom, she would try and explain the missing muscle away that, well, maybe I fell off the bed when I was a baby and did something there, cracked some ribs or something where the muscle didn't develop below that or whatever. But you learn later on that it's not super common, but that it's not a birth defect that a lot of people don't have. But we were living there on the old homestead there, my grandma's place, and my dad and my uncle farmed it together there. And for the first 5 years of my life, they both lived there, I don't remember, because I was 5 years old when we moved down to the home I grew up in, the house I grew up in a half mile down the road. But I do have a number of memories from those days, and they were good memories. I'm sure there were a lot of negative things happened in those days, but the things I remember were pleasant. We had a lot of fun. I'm playing with my older brother, Leon, and I did. I remember we had little metal graders we'd use in the sandbox, and we wore those things out, just playing, climbing the big hill. We felt like it was a mountain. It doesn't look that big nowadays, but out behind my grandma's house there, out in the cow pasture. And we had farm dogs that were, real nice dogs, and just don't have negative memories, My uncle wasn't married yet there in those earliest years, so it was him and my grandma in one end of the house, and we were in the other, and just a lot of good times there. We had no TV, we had no telephone, didn't have either one of those things actually till I was about 15 years old. But a couple of almost tragic things that happened back there that I do remember, and that was one of them was we had a kerosene cook stove in the kitchen. And every once in a while, something went wrong there, and I don't know what. But I don't know if my mom didn't totally get it turned off or just what happened, but it would start to just smoke and just smolder. I know it happens other times, and she would just catch it, But one time it started in during the night, and everybody had gone to bed. And oh my goodness, I woke up to my dad's deep voice in the stairway. The house was just full of black sooty smoke. And I heard my dad's voice, and somehow, he would always stay calm right through everything like that. And I just heard him, say, we've got a problem here, boys. Get out of bed, stay down on the floor, crawl to the stairway. Leon, in his jump to action way, said he just jumped up right into the smoke and just like choking half to death, and didn't. It took him a few minutes to figure out, no, I really do need to get down on the floor, because all the smoke had risen. I just crawled out on the floor, I remember, as just a little kid. And I could remember being able to see down at the floor, just dimly through the light that was there coming through the smoke. But you could see the layer of smoke above you, just like a solid layer, So I crawled over and crawled down the stairs, and we got outside, and they got this, smoking stove shut down and fans blowing and everything. I remember standing out in the yard half frozen to death. It wasn't winter, but it was a chilly night. I don't even remember if it was fall or spring or what. And we're just like shaking and shivering out there. And finally they get the smoke cleared out, and mostly. And of course, took a lot of cleaning for my mom and stuff after that, because there was smoke all over everything. But that was in my grandma's house when we were still living there. So I was probably 4 at the time, something like that, because I was big enough to remember that and everything. But we moved when I was 5, so it was before that. And one other memory I'd always had of when I think about 4 at that time also. I was I was looking at this empty light bulb socket, and in my curiosity, because you put a bulb in there, it would shine, and I figured there's something going on down in there. So I stuck my finger down in there, and I just stuck it down onto the contact at the bottom, and oh my goodness, I got like certainly the worst shock I'd ever gotten up to that point. And it just jolted my whole being, and I was like, whoa, don't want to try that again. But those were a couple of things I remembered. I mentioned the hillside up there above our barn. It was kind of gullied and washed out from the old cow paths and everything that had been there for decades. And we loved going up there and playing, and we would dig in those and climb and do all of our boy things, and it was just some real good times there. We still, in those days, had our last team. Even though my dad and uncle had bought a tractor, a Farmall H tractor, they bought it new, and we used that thing till it died. Over the years, I was still using it that's the tractor I learned to drive on everything. But they still had the last team of workhorses. This team, Colonel and Diamond were their names, and they were big, old, heavy, working horses, but they were old there when I was young, and we didn't use them for a whole lot. I remember my dad hooking them up once in a while for some odd thing, But one thing they did get used for in the summertime when we were putting up hay, we had just an old-fashioned hay loader, which just loaded the hay, full length up on a wagon, and then we'd bring it in and pull the wagon with the tractor there and pull the wagon up in the barn. But to unload it, there was this big hay fork up in the barn, and it would drop down from up on all these ropes and pulleys on the ceiling, and you had to, shove these big fork tines. They would spread way out down into the hay load, and then this rope came around through a whole pulley system, went outside, and they would take the horses and hook them up to this rope. and then they just pulled the rope out, and that would take a big bunch of hay up and lift it way up to the top in the barn. And then whichever way you had things switched, it would go one direction or the other. And you could take it out there and pull this trip rope and trip the hay up there. And it was how you got the hay loaded up into the high barn and filled up the whole thing that way. But they used those horses for that all the time. So, but the horses then kind of got used less and less. And my dad didn't really want to, we'd talk about selling them they talk about selling old horses to the glue farm. I don't know how they used them for glue, but old animals like that a lot of times went to the mink farms that raised mink commercially for their skins. And like if you had an old sick cow or something, those people would buy them. They don't allow that anymore, but my dad didn't really want to sell these old horses. They had worked for years and years and years, and so they were still around. Well, when we had moved down to where we lived after I was 5, we didn't have a big high barn door. We just had sheds there. And one night there in the winter, we had the horses down at our place. It was real, real cold. It was real windy. It was going to be just a terrible night. And my dad was out there trying to get these horses to go inside. Well, one of them went inside. The other one would not go through that door. And I remember just laying in bed that night, just hardly able to sleep, worrying about that horse out there. And I thought, oh, we're going to find it dead in the morning. But in the morning, I got up and went out, and it was standing outside, just covered with frost and everything else. But one other memory, too, about the horses there. One real cold day, we went to a school called Cloverdale School. It was this one-room country school. And at my grandma's house, it was just a little short ways up to the school. It was just kind of up the hill a little bit from her driveway. But it was over a half a mile from where we moved to get up there. But one super cold winter day after I had started school, I was probably just in first grade. But my dad couldn't get the car started or anything. It was just too cold. So he took the horses and harnessed them up and hitched them to a thing called a stone boat, which is just kind of a flat sled-like thing you pull. And they used them to pick up stones out in the field and other things too. But he hitched the horses to that thing. And he put an old water tank we had on it and covered it up with blankets and stuff, and had my brother and I get inside the tank. And it was pitch dark under those blankets, and we're sitting there in the cold and just rattling along. It was so rough riding of this thing up this gravel road. And he took us to school there with the team of horses and dropped us off. They never closed school for anything. I don't think. It was just, didn't matter, And there were some other kids came and they had horses and nice sleighs and stuff in those. And some people got their vehicles started. And so the kids showed up, and my dad always made sure the stove was going and the schoolroom got warm and everything. So
that's mostly what we got for the early years at the old homestead. Is there anything else that you want to mention about the homestead before we kind of move on to move into the new house in 19?
My dad and my uncle, their main source of income was milking cows and selling milk. And of course, which they had done all their lives, had been a big source of their income. And they were making good money back in those earliest days. They had nice machinery. They would buy most things new. They had nice cars. But those milk cows were important, and further on, they'll be important too.
So in 1946, you're born, and for the next 5 years, you stay with your grandparents till 1951. What was that transition like, moving out of your grandparents' house and into the old rental house?
Yeah, my my grandma there owned the old farmstead. There was originally 80 acres there, a quarter mile by a half mile, running east and west, and then somewhere way back, and I have no information about when, that I don't know if it was my grandpa or my dad and my grandma or who in the world, but they bought a 40-acre piece to the south of that along the road. And that's where mostly that was cow pasture, big hill, some woods and other things. So it was 120 acres, almost. It was 119 actually, because the old schoolhouse had 1 acre, which was interesting back in those days. Those government schools, those one-room schools, they would lease an acre of land usually from some homeowner, or somebody owned a farm there. And then that lease, well, like at Cloverdale, and I understand they did this as a general policy, that lease was only valid as long as there was a school functioning on this land. And if they ever came to the place where that school closed, then that land reverted back to the original owner. And so that's what eventually happened to that after our neighbors, the Knutsons, had bought my grandma's place years later. And the school had closed and consolidated why that land went back to them. But so there was 120 acres there. But my dad and my uncle, somewhere back there, in the 40s still, had bought the 80 acres just north of the homestead. It's quarter mile wide and a half mile long, and it ran right along a paved county road there between the old homestead and that county road. And there was a house on it there. There is a house on it, I should say. It's still there. My brother Pete still lives in it there. But they had rented that house out to some people because they didn't really need it at first there for several years. But then as our family started growing, and it was my older brother and I, and we're starting to get a little bit bigger, and then Jim came along, and he was still just a little toddler because he was like a year and a half old when we moved. I think he's 3.5 years younger than me. And then my uncle he wasn't married yet then, but he was, they're thinking about getting married there and stuff. And just several things contributed to the fact that house, my grandma's house, was getting too small. So they told the renter, when their cycle was up, that they were going to need the house. And we moved down to that house. And that house was beautiful. The lady that owned it had beautiful gardens and flowers all over the place. She had more stuff than my mom could keep up with, taking care of a family and everything. But yeah, it looked like a Better Homes and Gardens house in those days. And it was probably I'm quite sure it was the nicest looking place in the whole neighborhood. And it was right there on the road where everybody saw it, and she really kept it up. My mom, during her active years, kept it up pretty well, but a lot of things she just let go of, some of the flower beds and stuff. She just didn't have time, raising eventually 5 boys. She kind of little by little let a lot of it go. And of course, then after she got sick and was gone and everything, why it really started going downhill more, because just my dad and my brother there. Back when we moved in, though, I was 5 years old. We had never had a refrigerator when I was real little. Our well up at my grandma's had the coldest, still does, the coldest water you could ever imagine. It came right out of the north side of a big hill, out of the limestone layers down there. And it would just make your teeth chatter. It was so cold. Well, they ran water from that well through a tank in the milk house, and then from that tank, it ran off down to the cattle tank. And since they had quite a lot of cattle, they had to pump a lot of water. And so that tank stayed really cold. So they kept the milk in there that they were selling, which got picked up every couple of days or so. And if there were things we needed to keep cold, we just put them in a container, set them in the water tank, But when we moved, we needed a refrigerator. So they bought this small old Sears cold spot refrigerator. And that was in 1951. And that refrigerator was still standing there running after 50 years. And it was actually still working, but not very good anymore. And it was so worn out. The only thing I think we ever fixed, according to my brother, was put a new compressor belt in it once or twice and a couple minor electrical parts or something. But finally, the handle broke off the door, and he had a piece of pipe fastened on there for a handle and everything else. So, but that was interesting. The thing was small, but it weighed a ton. It was so heavy. But that stood right there in the kitchen and ran for 50 years. So
you move into this new house at 5, and you start school the year after moving. What was school like for you as a kid?
Yeah, of course, I started school in the fall of 52. And the one-room country school, you had no kindergarten. It was just first grade through 8th grade, all at that school. And then you went off to high school, and really at that point, they didn't have any junior high or middle school or anything like that. And so it was first through 8th grade, and then high school was 9th through 12th. Well, I started then in first grade there at our little school, went there all 8 years. I was 13 in 1960, in the spring of 60, and turned 14 that summer, and that was when I finished 8th grade. Those years were pretty, nothing ever changed. It was pretty much, I think, the same kids I started with, I finished with, because we were all farm kids. Our parents were just there to stay. We had 1 or 2 kids that moved into the area and then moved away. And I think there was one kid came in 8th grade and then he finished with us. But very little ever changed. And so we would have one teacher and for all 8 classes, and they were trained to do this. But those were good years, except towards the end, and we'll get into that more as we go along. But as things started deteriorating at home and life got really more and more difficult, I just started not appreciating school anymore either.
So you mentioned your dad was always helping out with the school. He was on the school board. What was the parents' involvement like at that little country school back there in the 50s when you were growing up?
Well, all the parents, just shouldered responsibility because that's what people did back in those days, You just took on responsibility. And so it was a thing of, everybody felt at least some level of responsibility for everybody's kids. And so it was kind of a joint effort. And some people more and some people less, But I don't really know what meetings and stuff looked like. I think they had school board meetings. I'm sure they did. And I think they meet once in a while, like with the school superintendent from the area who would come by sometimes and check on what was going on and everything. And but we had good teachers there the whole time I went through. I felt like, but my dad was always active in just making sure, that what he could do, got done, and just checking if something needed fixing. I remember him going up several times, like fixing a swing with a broken chain, and he would just. I think more than a lot of the people, he kind of took on a lot of responsibility there. Too, but especially in the cold winter, I just remembered him. If the teacher was having a little bit of trouble with when you got an old oil stove, and it's 25 below zero, it's hard to get that thing going sometimes. But he would make sure, the school got warmed up, and of course Monday morning had been shut off all weekend. There was no running water or anything, so. Our running water was the students took a pail and ran to get it. But
talk some more about your experiences. I know we talked about a lot of stories and whatnot of going to school, and just what do you remember from those elementary school in middle school years?
You know, uh, uh, there weren't a lot of options like, sports teams or anything like that back in those days. But in the fall, when school would get rolling, we played softball. We had enough flat area, even though we're right into a kind of a little alcove into the big hill, to have a softball field. And we played tons of softball. And other games, that little kids would play. And we had a nice hill, though, on our school property. So when the snow came in the fall, it got too cold to play ball anymore. Everybody brought their sleds, and a couple people had little toboggans, and we'd start sliding. And it was sliding at recess time. So softball and sliding down the hill are the big memories. And sometimes we'd have a snowball fight, or we'd play ante over, throwing the softball over the school roof to the other side and run around trying to tag people. And Red Rover, let so-and-so come over. And Graham and I were just talking about the other day how everybody played that when they were kids, and everybody half killed themselves because, you'd get the weaker kids from the other team to go over first so you could capture them all. But then when the tough kids came, boy, I don't know how we didn't all break our arms and have concussions and everything else, but we got pretty rough. So, but I don't remember too many serious injuries, but we were just kids growing up, and the rough and tumble days. So, but that was fun. And
after experiencing the one-room schoolhouse and then going on to teach for several decades later in life, do you think that was an effective model for teaching?
That's a good question. The one teacher doing 8th grade is their setups, I say her because there were very few men doing it. It was mostly ladies doing it. They only had, a little bit of time for each class, and you had to teach all the subjects. But for everything they could, they would group first and second, third and fourth, fifth and sixth, seventh and eighth. So like in social studies and stuff, you'd switch back and forth. So you didn't have 8 classes, you had 4, in social studies. Some things you can't do that. You can't really do that in English. You can't do it in math at all. But science you can, and you can do it in some other areas. But the teacher, all those one-room houses, they had kind of a stage area up front that was a little bit higher. And up there, she would have a table and stuff, and classes would go up there to study. So as you were a little kid, you heard all this stuff going on up front, So you kind of had a preview. And then as an older student, you got it reinforced because you heard it again, And then as you got up to, I would say, maybe 4th grade, but certainly by 5th grade, 6th, 7th, 8th, as you got to the upper grades, then you had to help. So the teacher would call on you, like, you had several new spelling words for some 2nd graders, and she would say, okay, you take these to the back board and go over their spelling words with them or whatever. So you kind of became a teacher helper too. And wound up doing math and spelling and different things and reading and stuff like that, depending on, your strengths or whatever. So it kind of was a big joint project, It was like a huge homeschooling setup, but they had schools designed to teach these one-room country school teachers. They were called normal schools. I don't know why not normal. I guess they figured normal people grow up this way. Anyway, learning, for me, it always came real easy. Subjects did. It was like, I just cruised through most everything. With some more opportunity, I probably could have gone a lot further, especially in math in those days. But what math and stuff we did get down, we got down good. We had to learn all of our times tables and everything. I mean, you had to learn all that stuff. phonics and so on. There, it really got nailed down in us. So even though it nowadays people would look at it and say, "Oh my goodness, that's a terrible system," it I think got us ready for high school, ready for life better than a lot of what's done nowadays, which is some of the foolishness that's done in education in the name of education. Doesn't really get kids ready for life. It just that try and indoctrinate them into something or another. But back in those days, it wasn't. But one thing that was really different. See, I finished there in 1960, and Madeline Marie O'Hare and all of this atheistic stuff and the laws being passed to take Bible reading and prayer and everything out of public schools. That didn't happen till a couple, 2 or 3 years, a couple of years there after I was done at Cloverdale there. And I doubt even when they did that it changed much in what they did out in those rural schools. But our teachers, and I don't know how dedicated they were to the Lord or to church or anything else, but all the teachers you had, they would have at least a few times during the week, they'd have devotions, and they'd do something extended even. The teacher I had, Mrs. Webster, her name was, from 5th grade through 8th grade, 4 years there. She liked Christian adventure books for kids. And there was a series called the Danny Orless series. And she would get one of those just every once in a while. She'd do other things too, like read chapters out of the Bible and stuff for devotions. And I think it was Friday, we'd have an extra long devotion. And but she would read to us like a chapter out of a book like that, and then take prayer requests and pray, and it was just normal that you did that, and everybody not only expected it, that's what they knew was supposed to be happening, So, and not all the families went to church and stuff, the parents all the time, but they wanted their kids to get that. So that was really an important point, even though at the time I didn't see the importance of it. But I think, that influence was huge as far as being a Christian nation, just showing kids this is important. God's word is important, and praying is important, and it's just important to that we keep God in the center of what we're doing. And so that was really, really a positive point about those one-room country schools, especially because that was just a big thing. But there were a lot of fun times. Not, again, much negative memories at all, much of anything, again, except later on when things were falling apart at home.
The last thing I had on that school, you mentioned the merry-go-round that is still there. Like, I think you said you remember it going up. Is that right?
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, I believe that was when I wasn't in school yet. I think I was only like 5. And that merry-go-round, it's just this heavy steel thing with bearings in that just never quit, I guess. And plank benches to sit on, but it all came in pieces. And I remember my dad and a couple other guys up there bolting all these pieces together, getting it all ready. But then that thing had to be lifted up onto the post. And I remember, he was getting all the help he could get, kids and parents and everything else, because the thing is heavy. It's just old-fashioned heavy pipes and planks. And but they lifted it up on that thing, and it just, the last I knew, it was still just sitting there. And it's probably got trees growing up through it now. I don't know. But yeah, we used that thing a lot. And again, it was, it's funny, more of us didn't get hurt on it because we'd get big kids inside pushing, to spin it. And then they'd get going so fast sometimes that kids would fly off and go rolling on the outside. But anyway, it was, but we had a lot of fun with that old merry-go-round and got used for years and years and years. But again, it was a project there. My dad kind of spearheaded, to put that thing together. Leon was in school, and it may have been my first grade year, but I think it was before that. Yeah, so, but that was just a fun landmark there, really.
Yeah.
And we had swings, with chains and just board seats and hanging in a couple of trees. And yeah, so.
So that's pretty much everything we had down from a school perspective. But in those grade school years, tell us a little bit about your home life, your relationships there, and I guess what was life like, in those grade school years?
Yeah, the early years were awesome. The memories I had were good, and it seemed like, and of course, as a kid, I don't know if there were issues more developing than what I saw and remember with my parents and stuff. But up to the time when I was maybe 11 or 12 in through there, but certainly by the time I was 12, things had started to really deteriorate at home.
Later.
There were some real reversals in the income and farming and stuff, which we'll get into later on. And those were coming about more the last part of my elementary school years there. Life was, in one way, there was, we did a lot of hard work. Leon and I worked at home a lot, but we played a lot too. There was a lot of time just to roam the woods and the creek and things. So my mom was quite inventive in just coming up with kind of fun and things to do and that weren't expensive, but that we just really had fun with, different things for birthdays and other stuff. She was an awesome cook. Her background was all English pretty much. But when she married my dad, of course, he was 100% Norwegian, all his family was. She learned how to make all kinds of Norwegian food, and she was just a really good cook anyway, and a hard worker. So she would make great meals. As a kid, I didn't appreciate them that much, but I'd say, you think, wow, she really. But she would get up early and work, make breakfast, we would stop, as I got a little bit older there, about 10 or so in the morning. We had breakfast earlier, like 7 or something. But about 10 or so, we'd stop and we would have a big lunch of something or another. And she always had something, she'd make a cake or have, I don't know, might be fresh bread and strawberry jam out of her garden, but or something like that. And then in the middle of the day, we would eat our dinner. That was the biggest meal of the day normally. And like a Norwegian household, it wasn't the evening meal. It was that noon meal, 12, 1 o'clock, somewhere in there. And then we also would stop for afternoon lunch and then eat supper in the evening when everything was kind of done, the chores and everything. My dad was kind of adamant about the thing. When you got up in the morning, you went and did your chores. You took care of the animals first, and then you could go eat, But you had to get up and go do your chores first. And just one little thing there, I mentioned that we had chickens, so we had lots of eggs. We would sell eggs and to buy groceries and stuff and everything. But this couldn't have been too healthy, as many as we'd eat. But I remember my brother and I kind of having a contest one time who could eat the most eggs. And I love soft-boiled eggs. And I remember one day, and I mean soft-boiled eggs, not just runny yolks, but even runny whites and everything. So I remember one time eating 13 soft-boiled eggs. Like it was just like soup, putting them all in a bowl, throwing tons of salt in there. Like, I got 13, I think that was a little bit too much, but and we eat a lot of pork sausage. It was cheap and butter, and oh my, in cold winter weather, I remember I made pork sausage for breakfast a lot in the winter. Just this regular pork sausage, you'd fry it in an iron pan, and there'd be a lot of grease. But we would, when we were out working in the real cold weather in the winter, we would just take a big old slice of homemade bread, butter, put a bunch of butter on it, and after you'd taken the pork sausage out, just lay it butter side down right into the hot grease and just kind of soak it and just fry it a little bit and pull that out and just eat that grease. And it almost choke you now just thinking about it. But when you're outside working and it's like zero and the wind's blowing and everything, you burn up energy so fast that we just relish that. And years ago, reading about Eskimos eating just blubber off from whales and seeing pictures of kids just sitting on the ice, just chewing on raw blubber and blood running down their faces. And people be like, oh, how could you do that? And I'm like, well, we weren't far from it on those cold winter mornings. But anyway.
Then if you're eating breakfast at 7, how early are you having to get up and to finish all your chores with the animals before you do anything else?
I imagine a lot of times about 6 maybe or something, because we weren't like milking cows at the house there, and I'll explain all that later. We did have pigs, and so in the winter there was more work to do feeding the pigs. But in the summer, that was a lot easier because some of them were on pasture. We'd have hog pasture. And we had to check on them. I know when we had cattle out in the pasture, just like beef cattle and stuff in the summer, one of my jobs I remember doing in elementary school was I had to run down to the woods and or wherever they were and count the cattle and look at them, make sure nothing was sick and caught up in a fence or bush or something somewhere, and just make sure everything was there. And sometimes I got hard pressed sometimes to get back in time because I couldn't find something, or I keep trying to count and I couldn't get an accurate count because they kept walking around the brush. But yeah, some of it involved just checking everything, like in the summertime more. But yeah, in the winter you had to get hay to the cattle and get if you had pigs, get them fed and take care of the chickens and pick up the eggs. But you just get a routine, and you'd get through it quite quickly. So, yeah.
You mentioned your mom had a more English background, but then she learned from your grandma more about Norwegian cooking. What were some of the meals that she would make that you really enjoyed?
Okay. Well, she would try and make sure we had some kind of meat at least once a day, but potatoes were a huge center thing, that was our source of starch, our main source. We raised potatoes, we'd stack them, sack them in the basement, whatever. So we'd have potatoes all winter until we try and make them last until the new potatoes got going in the spring. And we got to start eating those. So I always tell people 365 days a year, there were probably at least 340, if not more days. We had potatoes of some form or another. And a lot of those were just like peeled and boiled in chunks, and then you'd mash them up on your plate or whatever. But she would also make, mashed potatoes or potato patties out of leftover potatoes and, just potatoes stuff, But potatoes and some meat, just old Norwegian food, or Northern European food, I guess you'd say, meat and potatoes type of thing. But also, she would always keep a big garden, and she canned tons of stuff in the summertime. And so we usually have green beans and a lot of that. She canned a lot of tomatoes. She canned peas and carrots and things like that too, various vegetables. But she'd also go down in the woods. We had a lot of berry bushes all over the place out in our land. and she'd pick a lot of berries that just grew wild. So she would have raspberries and what was called gooseberries, and sometimes some blackberries. But she also raised strawberries, and she'd get a bunch of strawberry stuff. Of course, the strawberry stuff got eaten up the quickest. We liked it the best, but but the other things too would we'd have on through the year. But she did a lot of canning. But my mother worked hard. She'd take care of the garden. She'd can stuff. She'd cook. Washed all of our clothes. And there were 5 of us boys and my dad, and none of us really did anything to help her, which is I don't say with pride at all, because we just didn't. And, but part of that is the system too. We had a lot of outside work to do. It was just considered we had our work, and if there was girls, they would have been learning to do stuff with my mom, but we had no girls. So, but looking back, I think she should have just said, "Okay, we don't have any girls here, so you boys are going to help me do a couple things." But she just never did. She just did it, just did whatever, and she served and served and served all many, many years, even when things got so bad in my folks' relationship and everything else. And us kids, we just didn't treat her nicely at all. But she always took care of us, and I'm just so glad she lived long enough to see us all come to know the Lord and just have a good relationship with all of us, and saw us go to the mission field to work, and she was just excited about that. But all of her long day, hours and days and years of raising 5 boys and a not too helpful or positive husband. She got to see some of the fruits of her labor anyway, while she was still here in this world. So
one of the things you had mentioned, and I thought this was interesting, she didn't know how to make the Norwegian dishes. You mentioned lefse, krabbenkake, a couple other things you had mentioned. But then you also said she would always, everything she made, she just somehow made it taste good. And then you said in those, in even the Norwegian dishes, she did better sometimes than your grandma did, which I kind of found funny.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Like we didn't care for a couple of things my grandma made because she liked, it seemed like more flour than sugar than the recipe would call for. But my mom made them taste good. She'd throw more sugar and everything. So, one interesting little note: there was a Norwegian dish named rumgrøt. Rumgrøt, I think the name it was, and she would try and make it every Christmas, and it was frustrating to her because there were only a few times I remember that she got it to do what it was supposed to do. And we would eat it anyway because it tasted okay. But when you did it right, and you just got it to come out right, that stuff was really, really good. So she would try it every year, but there was so there's just something that didn't quite click with her. But otherwise, she was a great cook. She baked a lot of bread. Oh my goodness, we'd go through so much bread. And she'd bake bread maybe 2 or 3 times a week. It seemed like every other day. Big batches of bread, homemade bread, big loaves, big like biscuits. And her homemade bread was awesome, especially when it was hot. And you had fresh strawberry jam to put on it. And make your mouth water thinking about it. So, and holidays were a big deal. Well, not every holiday, but Christmas especially. And she'd just cook everything then, and other times too, but not. Thanksgiving was too. Thanksgiving and Christmas, man, we had a real spread of everything. Thanksgiving is a little bit different because that was more American, and Christmas was more Norwegian.
Let's move on to kind of living on the farm as a kid. And you mentioned, every morning you're getting up at 6 a.m. and you're counting cows and you're doing that type of thing. What chores are you doing on the farm to kind of keep up with everything.
Yeah, in the earliest days there, when Leon and I were pretty young, we had a lot of pigs. And so besides just checking on them and some feeding, my dad did a lot of that feeding and stuff because we had so many of them. In the morning, like in the afternoon, usually, not in the morning, we had to go around and check all the electric fences if they were out on pasture at all, because you'd have an electric wire down low and the pigs would be rooting the dirt, and sometimes they'd push dirt up on the electric wire, or weeds or something would fall over on it. And so we had to go around with what was called a corn knife. It was just a curved blade with a handle on that they used to cut corn with, and shock it up at one time, but then just open up cornfields and stuff like that. And we'd use them to cut weeds with too. But as kids, they were about the right size where we could use them. And we had to walk all those fences and cut everything away and make sure the fence was working. And that was one job we had to do. And of course, we gathered eggs and took care of, when the baby chicks would come, it was all hands on board, because the baby chicks would come in these big flat boxes divided in 4 sections, and there were 25 baby chicks in each section. And we'd probably have, 500-600 of these chicks, and they'd all come in at once, So you had to be out there right away, and because they had been sent through the mail, they had come in a truck to the local mail carrier, and then he would bring them out, even if they weren't there for his regular route, because, he'd do half of them die if he just left them sit there. So he would be running around delivering chickens to people. And when they came, you had to have the brooders with the warmth, set up, and then you would open up a box, and you had to take every little chick, and you would stick his nose down in the water. We had a water tray there to make sure he got a little water in his beak. And then you would stick his nose down in the little chicken mash, the food tray, and then you shove them under the brooder. So it was like hundreds of these things, water, food, brooder, water, food, brooder. And so, yeah. But that was like one time a year, and then it was eggs and feeding them and everything too. And when they got old, sometimes we would just sell a whole bunch of them to the chicken dealer, and they would haul them off somewhere to make chicken stuff out of. But we also killed a lot ourselves too, and my mom would cook them up. But my mom also canned a lot of chickens, and the job fell to me to chop their heads off. So I remember chopping off like 25 chicken heads at a time, and my mom would just be going like crazy. She could pluck those chickens faster than anybody ever saw, and then get them cleaned, and then she'd cook them and can them just in mason jars, just like vegetables or something, So you'd have them later on and stuff too. So, but she made other homemade stuff. She would take. I never liked cabbage, but she would make homemade sauerkraut in this big crock thing she had. And that stuff was good. Very seldom now you ever see sauerkraut. I ordered some at a restaurant one day, and everybody was like, "Oh, what are you doing?" As a man, if this stuff is good, it's really good. And that was okay, but my mom's was sensational. Anyway, but she liked doing that, and it was good stuff. She also, with that same crock, would make just homemade dried beef when I was real young, we still had more cattle. My uncle was still around. Then they would butcher a beef once in a while, and we would my mom would take some nice cuts off it, and that big crock, and she would put water in there and put in a lot of salt and brown sugar, and I don't know what else. I think some vinegar and stuff. I'm not sure. But she would take these chunks of meat, just lean meat, and put them in that crock and just let them soak for, I don't know how long, several days. And then she would take those chunks and hang them up in the hallway leading upstairs, because that's where the air passed through a lot. There were registers that let the air go up into the rooms, and then it all come back and down the hallway. And so, but to get it to dry quicker, she would hang it up there. And of course, some of it never got very dry, because as soon as the outside of it started drying, my brothers we would take especially Leon and I, we'd take a real sharp knife and go up there and start peeling off pieces, because loved chewing on that salty, sugary, homemade, It wasn't jerky because it wasn't jerked. It was just the way it was, and it was tough. I remember my mother sometimes would make sandwiches out of that for school, and you could not eat it like a sandwich. You had to eat the bread and chew on the pieces of meat. But we loved that stuff. So
Okay.
it was very hard and dry, but just she would, she'd always kind of work on flavor, and she had whatever she used, she had a good mix. And one thing we had talked about there before a little bit during those days too. Well, this wasn't about my mom, but just about our growing up with our dad. As we got a little bit bigger, not like 8 years old or something, but once you passed like 10 or 12, when it came to fixing stuff, we had to learn how to fix stuff, And a lot of things my dad didn't necessarily know what to do with or whatever, but things were pretty standard. There wasn't any, technical stuff much, just bolts and nuts and things. And so Leon and I we had to learn how to fix stuff. And something broke down, my dad'd be like, go get the tools and fix it. And so we learned a lot of do it yourself, make it happen, figure it out type stuff, which I wasn't fond of during those years. I couldn't say, but when I got to Haiti and I got out in the mountains and things would break down, I was really, really thankful for the fact that when something broke down, you just like, okay, how do I do this? You didn't like, I'm going to die. No, you're not. Just fix it. That's so that was an important thing growing up, I think. I don't, I just don't really know if that was purposeful that much or just kind of necessary to make life work, because it had to get fixed and my dad was busy, and, so we just had to learn how to do everything.
And with that, we're done with episode 1, learning about some of the humble beginnings, about the Wisconsin farmhouse and farm and what life looked like in those early years. If there are any stories throughout this series that anyone would like to hear or have recorded, go ahead and reach out to any of us. Me, my grandpa, my dad. We'd love to get those stories recorded and put up in part of one of these episodes where they fit. And as always, if there's any feedback, uh, we're just figuring out this podcast thing for ourselves. So appreciate any feedback or support as we get this whole recording and editing and podcasting in general figured out. But thanks for listening. Thanks for sticking in to the end. I know we're a little over an hour on this first episode, but I hope you learned something, and I hope you'll listen next week to episode 2.